You're just staff. That's what Grayson said to me, standing under that ridiculous oil painting of his grandfather shaking hands with Reagan. The new interim CEO, fresh off a soul-searching semester in Florence and a legacy MBA from Columbia, looked me dead in the face like I'd just wandered in off the loading dock instead of being the one who kept this company's logistical veins unclogged for the last 6.5 years. I smiled, nodded, wrote down family company in the margin of my notes and underlined it twice. Funny thing about family companies, they run on invisible labor. People like me, who don't get press quotes, but get 2 a.m. phone calls when a refrigerated truck goes missing in Missouri. I wasn't blood, but I was the bloodstream. And I knew damn well Grayson didn't even know which vendors had exclusivity clauses or which facilities were still under city tax deferments. He thought the company was a brand. I knew it was a breathing, grinding, rust and steam operation held together with conditional clauses, handshake deals, and sheer institutional memory. By the way, if you've made it this far and stories like these hit home, do us a solid, tap that subscribe button and like the video. Over 97% of people listen without subscribing, and it really helps the team keep digging up stories like this one. Trust me, it gets better from here. Back to the moment, Malcolm Denning's funeral had barely cooled before Grayson started vision boarding his reign. New logos, new mission statements, and sustainable narrative branding presentations that made the finance lead dry heave into a Starbucks cup. I didn't speak much during those early meetings. I just listened. When the consultants arrived with their mock turtlenecks and catchphrases, I offered quiet corrections when their inventory projections didn't match real capacity. They didn't listen. Grayson didn't care. He was too busy revamping the website to notice we were about to default on a supplier incentive clause. I remember the exact moment I realized I'd become invisible. Not just overlooked, invisible. It was a Thursday. Grayson was on his third espresso, swiping through a New Era Initiative PDF on his tablet. I brought up a potential USDA compliance risk if they cut the QA team as outlined. He blinked twice and said, "That's not really your concern anymore." Then he smiled like he'd just complimented my haircut. My concern? I'd written the original QA charter Malcolm himself had signed in 2018. I'd negotiated the third-party audits that got us our multi-state certifications. But sure, not my concern. So I did what people like me do. I documented. Quietly. Thoroughly. I marked every contract revision, every governance shift, every structural bypass they pulled. I tracked budget reallocations and policy overrides, especially the ones that bypassed chain of command sign-off. Grayson thought he was steering a ship. What he didn't know was that the ballast, the stabilizer, was me, and I was slowly taking my hand off the wheel. After that meeting, I went back to my office, a windowless room beside facilities, and opened a locked drawer. Inside were two things: a flash drive labeled Policy Addenda Private and a sealed envelope with my name written in Malcolm's shaky handwriting. I hadn't opened it. Yet. They called it the New Era Initiative, like it was a rebranding of the Roman Empire, not a bloodletting of everything that actually made the company function. The consultants came in with more style than substance: Italian shoes, whiteboards on wheels, and TED Talk accents. Every slide was a caffeinated fever dream of modernity, cross-functional fluidity, sunsetting legacy dependencies, agile decentralization for values-forward evolution. Translation? They had no goddamn clue how a production floor actually worked. I watched them nod along as Grayson paced in front of the projector, tossing around words like optimization and founder fatigue, his pet term for anything his father built. He said it in a board meeting like he was diagnosing a terminal illness. I glanced down at my notes and drew a coffin around it. Then came the scalpel. They dropped our long-haul freight contract with Sampson Logistics, a partner we'd used since before I joined, who gave us preferred holiday routes no one else touched. Gone. Too expensive, they said, ignoring the 12% downstream spoilage rate that would kick in without it. Then they paused every R&D initiative not tagged brand vertical and shuttered 2 flavor labs, one of which had a patent pending on a protein stabilizer that could have added $18 million annually in shelf life extension revenue. I was still chairing the operations committee when he gutted the compliance division, just carved it up like a smoked ham. Legal flagged it. Grayson told them to trust the innovation process. By the end of the month, he'd reassigned my entire committee to junior managers with LinkedIn headshots that looked like they were auditioning for The Bachelor. And me? I got a thank you lunch. At a Panera, I didn't make a scene. I smiled, dipped my stale baguette into tomato soup, and told them I'd transition gracefully. But after that meal, I took the long way back to my car, walking past the main floor. I looked up at the old metal sign bolted over the operations wing. It still said Malcolm's Backbone. I touched the edge of it, let my fingers trace the rusting rivets. He'd once called me that, his backbone. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of rye and pulled out the flash drive. I hadn't opened Malcolm's envelope yet. I wasn't ready, but I opened the folder on the drive labeled Governance Back Channel. That's when I remembered the clause. Malcolm, paranoid in the best possible way, had asked me 3 years ago to review some hypothetical succession paperwork. He was worried about family fights, about what would happen when Grayson took over. He wanted a backdoor failsafe, something that wouldn't show up in the board charter or the official bylaws. What we came up with was elegant in its simplicity, a private governance appendix, reviewed by his personal counsel, notarized, and bound to a separate copy of his will. The core condition? That in the event of any internal governance dispute, defined by even a single triggered conflict between executives, departments, or compliance reporting chains, his personal vote as founder would be transferred to the most senior, uninterrupted operational leader. There was only one name that met that threshold: mine. Grayson didn't know it existed. The consultants didn't know to look. It had never been mentioned in board minutes, but it was real. And if he kept pushing, that clause was going to activate. So I waited. They wanted a new era. I'd give them one, just not the kind they had in mind. I could tell from the second Grayson crossed his legs like he was posing for a Forbes cover that he thought this was a coronation, not a will reading, an unveiling. He leaned back in the leather chair like he was already deciding which walnut-paneled boardroom would become his podcast studio. His cousins flanked him like backup dancers at a trust fund review, all loafers and family crest cufflinks. And then there was me, standing behind a potted plant that had been fake since the Clinton administration. The room still smelled like Malcolm. Old pipe tobacco, linseed oil, and that faint metallic trace of copy toner that clung to every damn report I ever handed him. I glanced at the framed newspaper from 1984 on the back wall. Local cannery expands to 5 states. He'd circled the word local in red ink decades ago. He always said, remind them where we started. Now they were trying to erase it all with latte buzzwords and vision statements printed in pastel fonts. The family lawyer, Mr. Feldman, looked older than death and half as amused. He read through the formalities like someone reading the back of a cereal box: stock allocations, property, charitable trusts. Then came the shift, the pause you only catch if you've lived through real boardroom bloodletting. Feldman looked down at a small envelope that had been sitting quietly by itself. No wax seal, no flourish, just my name in the old man's handwriting. He cleared his throat and said, "There is an addendum." Grayson smirked like a man about to watch a longtime maid get gifted a nice fruit basket and a "thank you for your service" card. I braced. Feldman opened the envelope slowly, like it was ticking. Then he read the line, monotone, like it meant nothing. In any dispute regarding governance, my full vote transfers to Nathan Brome. Silence. The kind that's not just quiet, but gutted. You could hear the shift in the HVAC. One of the cousins tilted his head like the sentence didn't compute. Another cousin's eye twitched. Feldman folded the note back into the envelope like he'd just triggered a landmine and didn't want to touch the shrapnel. Grayson's smile stayed, just long enough to be polite, then disappeared like steam off a frozen windshield. He blinked twice, once at me, once at the lawyer. "I'm sorry. What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Feldman said, adjusting his glasses, "in any governance disagreement, should one arise, Mr. Brome will cast Malcolm Denning's founder vote, which, as you know, carries the weight of 2 board seats." I didn't move, didn't speak. I just locked eyes with Grayson and tilted my head just slightly. He blinked again. His jaw clenched the way it always did when someone brought up something he didn't study in grad school. "Is this binding?" he asked. Feldman nodded. "It's notarized, registered, and cross-referenced in the private governance appendix your father filed with our office 3 years ago. I can forward the PDF." I swear, for 1 second, I thought one of the cousins was going to faint. Another stood up like he was about to protest, then realized he had no idea what to say. Their entire inheritance, this throne they were so certain Grayson was being handed, suddenly tilted off-center. It wasn't a coup, it was a clause, a line, a signature, a man who knew his bloodline better than they thought and planned accordingly. Grayson sat there, eyes darting from person to person, looking for some adultier adult to fix the moment. No one moved. Behind me, I heard someone shift their weight. In front, the press folder that Grayson had brought, probably filled with pre-drafted statements, sat untouched on the table. I exhaled quietly and folded my arms. The vote was mine now. And Grayson? He'd just realized the head of the table had been reserved long before he got there. Grayson didn't speak to me for 5 days. Not a call, not an email, not even a passive-aggressive calendar reschedule. For a man who once replied all to congratulate himself on another stellar brand alignment sync, the silence was deafening. But I didn't need to hear his voice to know what he was doing. I've seen his type before. Power by inheritance, strategy by panic. He was calling every lawyer in a 40-mile radius, digging for a loophole. Spoiler, there wasn't one. Malcolm hadn't been a sentimental man. He didn't trust legacy as a business model, just as a tax burden. 3 years ago, he'd called me into his office after hours, the lights low, his voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. Cancer was already winning, but he still had that sharpness behind his eyes, that need to finish the game before leaving the table. "I need a backstop," he'd said, "in case the bloodline forgets how to read a balance sheet." That night, I stayed while his personal counsel walked us through the structure of the Appendix Clause, not part of the main governance charter, too visible. Instead, it was filed with the private counsel under a mirrored document agreement, one physical copy in Feldman's vault and a notarized digital twin, offline, encrypted, and time-stamped to the minute. There was no board vote needed to activate it, just a condition. If any internal disputes arose post-succession, defined specifically as operational obstruction, policy conflict, or procedural bypass, his founder's vote would shift to the longest-serving uninterrupted officer. That was me. And I hadn't taken a single day off in 6 years. Not even when my sister got married in Asheville or when I fractured my ankle falling down the back stairs of the South facility. I kept showing up because I didn't trust what the company would become if I didn't. Malcolm knew that, so he bet on it. What Grayson never understood was that every cut he made, every time he blew off a compliance requirement or bypassed a procedural vote, he was slowly walking himself into that clause. I documented everything, not because I wanted to use it, because I knew one day I might have to. The first trigger came when he pushed through a procurement revision without CFO countersign. That violated Section 7.4A of the internal charter. Then came the compliance lapse when he dissolved the Safety Oversight Subcommittee and transferred its responsibilities to an unlicensed consultant. The third and final was the unratified restructuring plan that eliminated the Operations Committee without full board review. 3 strikes. Feldman confirmed the timeline and matched it to the clause. Just like that, Malcolm's voice rose from the grave, not as a memory, but as 2 board votes that answered to me and me alone. Grayson had no idea how quickly the walls had started closing in. He thought it was just a legal footnote, maybe even something that could be negotiated. But this wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about recognition, of work, of legacy, of the unglamorous, spreadsheet-stained backbone of a company run for decades not by speeches, but by systems. And I wasn't about to let a rebranded heir gut it because he thought governance was a vibe. No, he triggered the clause. Now I was the clause. Grayson called the emergency vote like a man throwing a lit match into a haystack and daring everyone to blink. He'd gotten word that I'd quietly frozen approval on the new supplier contract, his prized pivot to an overseas distributor that promised modern efficiencies, but would have slaughtered our domestic jobs, destabilized half our logistics network, and triggered state-level subsidy violations in 2 regions. But none of that mattered to him. He wanted his name on a strategic transformation initiative, not a footnote in a USDA audit. The boardroom filled fast. Half the members still wore jackets with the company crest from Malcolm's era. The other half dressed like they'd just stepped off a golf course. Grayson stood at the front of the table, fists pressed into the varnish, reciting his talking points like a hostage reading cue cards. I didn't sit at the table. I stood by the coffee urn, silent, a manila folder in my arms and nothing on my face. "This delay is costing us momentum," he barked. "We need decisive action, not procedural snags." One of the older board members cleared his throat. "The procurement freeze was legal." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "It was blocked by a staffer. That's not board protocol." I stepped forward then, just enough to place the folder in front of legal, Ms. Hartwell, who had served under Malcolm for 15 years and didn't blink unless prompted by death itself. Actually, she said evenly, opening the folder, the block came from Mr. Brome, acting under the authority granted via the governance appendix. You were present at the reading of the will. That authority includes full proxy use of Malcolm Denning's founder votes in any governance dispute. This qualifies. He laughed. It was a shaky, high-pitched thing that sounded more like boiling panic than humor. Are we seriously letting a non-family staffer overturn the direction of this company based on a technicality? Hartwell didn't flinch. She turned the page to the high-resolution scan of the clause. Malcolm's signature, dated, witnessed, filed. Then she flipped to the next sheet. And here is the time-stamped video, Malcolm himself reading the clause into record per his counsel's request. The screen flickered as a monitor on the table played the footage. Malcolm, thinner and paler than I'd last seen him, stared into the camera like he knew exactly who would be watching someday. If my family prioritizes branding over backbone, he said slowly, I want the person who kept this place standing to have the final say. The room went dead still. Grayson's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked around the room, hunting for allies. The cousins weren't present. This wasn't their level. The older board members looked at their papers. One rubbed his temple, another folded her hands. Then came the vote. Motion to override the procurement block. All in favor? 3 hands. All opposed? 5 hands. Plus 2 proxy votes, mine. Motion failed. Grayson's face flushed, then went chalk white. This is absurd, he said. He's just a staffer. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Hartwell slid the video screen away and said, he is Malcolm's chosen governance proxy, and this board just reaffirmed his authority. Unless there's a legal challenge you'd like to file, the decision stands. Grayson didn't move. For one long second, he looked like a boy told he couldn't take his toys to summer camp. Then he turned sharply and left the room without a word. The door closed behind him like the final note of an old hymn. Nobody congratulated me. Nobody clapped. They just sat there, still, quiet, suddenly aware that the room had shifted. Not by force, not by vote-counting games, by gravity. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down, opened my notepad, and we moved on. The press release was supposed to hit at 10:20 a.m. sharp, drafted, polished, preloaded in every inbox. Denning Foods begins bold new chapter under family leadership. It had Grayson's smug, overlit headshot tucked neatly between paragraphs about generational vision and modern governance alignment. A bloated eulogy for a man still warm in the ground, if you asked me. But 9:43 came and went, and nothing dropped. By 9:52, I knew something had shifted. The chairman himself walked down to the comms floor, something he hadn't done in 6 years, not even during the IPO whisper rounds. He called the press team into a conference room and shut the door. 10 minutes later, every scheduled post, email blast, and public statement was pulled, archived, buried, not delayed, silenced. The internal tracker changed to governance status, pending review. That's when the tremors started. At 10:15, logistics pinged me. One of our Tier 1 distributors in the Midwest had reached out, confused why a new purchasing directive had just been rescinded without explanation. They wanted clarity on whether the new sourcing strategy was still real. I told them, in neutral language, that all decisions related to strategic procurement were temporarily suspended. At 10:32, Finance forwarded a panicked message from a regional co-packer in Kentucky who'd already prepped labor shifts to match Grayson's now paused supplier pivot. By lunchtime, Legal had fielded calls from 3 compliance partners and 1 USDA rep. The last one had real teeth. The funny thing about governance structures is that they're like plumbing. No one notices until a pipe bursts. And when Grayson had gutted compliance oversight for the sake of streamlined innovation, he'd unknowingly triggered an automatic escalation clause in our federal vendor file. That clause required us to notify the USDA of any executive restructuring that touched regulatory decision-making. Grayson had never filed it. I did. At 12:17 p.m., I sent an email to the USDA contact listed in our grant compliance packet. Subject: Urgent. Executive restructure. Documentation discrepancies. I attached redlined versions of Grayson's staffing chart revisions, time-stamped before board ratification. I also included archived versions of our internal compliance reporting chain, one before Grayson's edits, one after. A 5-minute comparison showed 6 violations of our USDA grant conditions. I ended the email with a single line. Per Clause 6B of our award agreement, this constitutes formal notice. By 2 Quoc, we were under review. Regulatory freeze. All open grants paused. Vendor contracts that relied on subsidy validation flagged for legal hold. HR's phone started ringing off the hook. Every external partner wanted to know if Denning was collapsing or just convulsing. And Grayson? He still didn't get it. He stomped into my office, reclaimed after the vote like a factory floor under new management, and slammed a copy of the unreleased press kit on my desk. You undermined my leadership, he hissed. I looked at the bold headline, his name in serif font, and said, No, you skipped the part where leadership is earned. He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. And just so you know, I didn't leak anything. I followed protocol. You should try it sometime. He stared at me like I'd just spoken another language, because to him, rules were things that applied to the people who weren't born into the photo albums on the boardroom wall. The irony? If he'd just let the announcement go out, the house might have stood a little longer. But he pulled too hard on a foundation he never understood, and now the pipes were hissing, the beams groaning, and every regulator we ever danced with was watching the building lean. I didn't ask for this storm, but I sure as hell knew where to stand when the rain started. The room smelled like old wood and expensive panic. Not one of the board members said a word when Grayson walked in late, hair slicked back like a cable news guest and phone still in hand like he could tweet his way out of this. He scanned the faces, none smiled. No one stood. That was the first sign. This wasn't a meeting, it was a verdict. I'd been looped in the night before, a discreet email from the chair titled Session Agenda Governance Stability, not sent to staff, not copied to Grayson. It came directly to me, proxy holder, as they now referred to me in footers and file names. There was no preamble that morning, no pastries, no quarterly charts, no icebreakers. Just 12 people in a room, one empty chair left open at the head of the table, and a sealed envelope marked Emergency Session Materials Confidential. Each member had one. I didn't need to read mine. I'd written half of what was inside. Grayson sat slowly, confusion masking panic, like a man trying to guess the stakes of a game after it's already started. The chair cleared his throat. Let's begin. 1 agenda item. Leadership continuity. The first to speak was Ms. Vane, one of the oldest board members, originally appointed by Malcolm himself. She leaned forward and, without glancing at Grayson, said, We've endured 6 weeks of avoidable instability. The Founders Clause was not symbolic, it was preemptive. Then Mr. Lin, Finance. Vendor trust has collapsed. Compliance flags are spreading. Market confidence is shaken. We've reviewed the USDA findings and the sourcing contract violations. This is not about succession. It's about survivability. Grayson tried to cut in. The chair held up a hand. You are not here to defend. You are here to witness. And then it happened. The first vote, to remove Grayson Denning from executive authority, passed 8-3. Second vote, to reassign the founder's proxy permanently until the clause expires, passed unanimous. Third vote, to appoint an interim executive oversight until formal stability review. The chair turned to me. You hold 2 votes per Malcolm's designation. Are you prepared to cast them now? I nodded once. The motion passed before the pen lifted. The room was still. The weight of it didn't fall like a gavel. It settled like dust in a vault. Clean, cold, undeniable. Grayson stood, didn't argue, didn't demand. He just looked at me. For a second, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Rage, maybe, or relief. Maybe even the boy he used to be before the legacy warped him into someone who thought blood outranked balance sheets. He turned, left the room, closed the door behind him without a word, and no one followed. We stayed seated. A minute passed, then another. The chair finally exhaled. Well, he said quietly, we've got work to do. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just reached for the binder I'd brought with me, the one labeled Recovery Map Phase 1, and laid it flat on the table. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just shows up, takes a seat, and writes the next chapter. The offer came in a plain envelope, no seal, no ceremony. The chair slid it across the table like it was a lunch receipt, not the culmination of 6 years of invisible labor finally being acknowledged by people who once called me non-voting support. I opened it and scanned the title. Not CEO, not president, no corner office moniker or glossy nameplate. Operational steward. It sounded humble. Domestic. Like I'd been handed the keys to a 200-year-old tractor instead of the helm of a legacy food empire. I accepted without hesitation. No speech, no staged photo in front of the headquarters. Just a formal vote, a notarized agreement, and a quiet line in the minutes. Governance oversight to be held by appointed steward pending completion of 2 fiscal cycles and full regulatory restoration. I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted the infrastructure to stop bleeding. The first week, I started at the docks, literally. Walked the perimeter with shipping leads who hadn't seen a board-level exec since the Bush administration. Checked in on the QA lab, now running short-staffed and with 2 backlogged audits. I made 3 calls to old suppliers, asking not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Malcolm used to say the work starts where your shoes get dirty. Mine were covered in warehouse dust by Wednesday. Meanwhile, Grayson disappeared. Technically, it was a sabbatical, announced via internal HR memo with the usual HR flair, an opportunity for personal reflection and recalibration. But anyone with a calendar and a memory knew he wouldn't be coming back. His last act before vanishing into whichever retreat center or vineyard would have him was to recall every pending PR draft that bore his name. The website quietly reverted to an older banner. His headshot came down. No announcement. Just a slow deletion, like someone finally realizing the brand couldn't carry a name that hadn't earned the weight. The family, to their credit, didn't protest. His cousins, once peacocking in family-embroidered blazers, now spoke softly when board meetings opened. One even reached out, privately, to thank me, not for replacing Grayson, but for not turning the boardroom into a battlefield. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Some things settle better in silence. Legal revalidated our USDA compliance within 6 weeks. Vendor confidence returned slowly, then all at once. The contracts I'd halted were renegotiated, not canceled. We reinstated key teams. We didn't call it the new era. We called it the recovery. One morning, over coffee in the finance wing, I overheard a junior analyst reciting the company's original motto, "Quality is built, not bought." He fumbled it a little. A week later, a new line appeared in the internal employee newsletter. Not a banner, just a footer. Trust is built, not inherited. It didn't say who wrote it, but I knew. It wasn't mine. It was Malcolm's. All I'd done was honor the logic behind it. The rest, every vote, every signature, every quiet correction, that was just restoration. Not revenge, not legacy, just balance, earned one line at a time. 6 months to the day after that last vote, a facilities manager named Carla, sharp, quiet, a marvel with asset tags, called me down to the old executive suite. They were doing a routine audit of storage areas, prepping the space for potential lease to a vendor incubator. In Malcolm's office, behind the bookshelf that only opened if you pressed the binding of his 1981 NRA membership journal, they found a wall safe. No one remembered the combination, but Carla didn't need it. She found it etched inside the spine of Malcolm's personal Rolodex, the same Rolodex he never let anyone update, even after we digitized the whole vendor system. "Paper remembers," he used to mutter. Inside the safe were 2 envelopes. One yellowed slightly at the edges, folded neatly, no seal. The other, clean, crisp, thick stock paper, bore my name in Malcolm's unmistakable script. Slanted, sharp, firm. It was untouched, still sealed. Carla handed them to me and left the room without a word. I opened the unmarked one first. No date, no header, just 3 lines, scrawled in Malcolm's old felt-tip pen. "If you're reading this, you probably think you've won something. You haven't. You've been trusted with what I protected. Don't prove me wrong." At the bottom, just 2 initials. MD. That was all. No praise, no sentiment, no thank you, just expectation. He knew. He knew what the family might become, what ambition without structure could erode, what trust, once handed blindly, would cost in blood, in jobs, in memory. He didn't write to congratulate me, he wrote to warn me. And the other envelope, mine, still sealed, still waiting, I held it, weighed it, stared at it in the afternoon sun leaking through the dusty blinds, and I didn't open it, not out of fear, out of respect. Some things only need to be said if the person they were meant for has forgotten who they are. I hadn't. So I tucked it back into the safe, locked the door, and handed the combination to Carla with a note. "Seal, archive, no access without my signature." She nodded. Later that evening, I walked the south production floor. Same concrete smell, same machine hum, but steadier now, restored. Grayson hadn't returned. No one asked when he would. The family stopped referring to him as interim anything. At my desk, I updated the final governance report for the fiscal year. No titles listed, just a line on page 7 under Special Provisions. Founder proxy status expires next quarter, oversight to transition per standard succession charter. I closed the file, saved, printed one copy for the archive. Legacy, it turns out, isn't about who sits at the head of the table. It's about who gets remembered when the lights flicker, and who keeps them on.